They told her the apartment wasn't available. They told her the building was full. And then, 3 days later, the same listing went back up online at the same price, with the same photos, and a new name on the application form. A name that didn't belong to a black woman from Winnipeg with a last name that nobody around Millbrook could pronounce. Sergeant First Class Amara Osei-Nkrumah had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, a roadside bomb outside Kandahar that took 2 fingers off her left hand, and a military tribunal that tried to bury her promotion for 18 months. She had not survived all of that to be told, politely, with a smile and a brochure, that a 2-bedroom apartment in a mid-range building in suburban Ontario was somehow unavailable to her. But that was exactly what happened on a Wednesday morning in late September, when she walked into the Millbrook Terrace leasing office with a banker's draft, a letter of employment from CFB Borden, and a credit score that her financial advisor called, and these were his exact words, embarrassingly good. The building was called Millbrook Terrace, which was generous. It sat on the eastern edge of Barrie, Ontario, wedged between a strip mall and a drainage ditch. The units were clean and the location was convenient. 15 minutes from the base, 20 from her daughter's school. That was all Amara needed. After 18 months in temporary housing following her divorce, she wanted something stable, something that was hers. She had called ahead. The leasing agent, a man named Patrick Colby, had been warm on the phone, enthusiastic even. He'd told her the 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor had been sitting empty for 6 weeks. He'd told her it had a nice view of the ravine. He'd told her to come by Wednesday morning and they'd get the paperwork sorted. Amara showed up at 9:47 a.m. in her civilian clothes, dark jeans, a pressed blouse, her natural hair in a protective style. She looked exactly like what she was, a 41-year-old military professional with money in her account and nowhere to be except this office. Colby's expression changed the moment she walked through the door. It was subtle. The kind of shift that people who have never experienced it say they're imagining, and that people who have experienced it recognize immediately. A slight tightening around the eyes, a recalibration, a brief hesitation before the smile came back online. "Miss Osei-Nkrumah," he said, glancing at his clipboard. He mispronounced it 3 ways in one attempt. "Welcome, please, have a seat." She sat. He sat across from her and opened a folder that, she would later remember, he never actually looked at. "So, I have some unfortunate news," Colby said, folding his hands on the desk. "The unit, the 3rd floor 2-bedroom, it's actually been taken off the market." Amara looked at him. "When?" "Just this week." "You spoke with me on Monday." "Yes, and I apologize for the timing. The owner decided to hold it for a family member. It happens sometimes with privately managed buildings. Out of my hands entirely." He slid a brochure across the desk. "We do have a 1-bedroom available on the 1st floor, south-facing, quiet side of the building." Amara didn't touch the brochure. "I need 2 bedrooms. I have a daughter." Of course. He nodded sympathetically. "Unfortunately, that's all we have at the moment." She asked him to check the listing. He told her the website hadn't been updated yet. She asked when it would be updated. He said he wasn't sure. She asked for the name of the building owner. He said that information was confidential. She thanked him, stood up and walked out. In the parking lot, she sat in her car for 4 minutes. She did not cry. She was long past the age of crying over this particular kind of thing. Instead, she took out her phone and screenshotted the active listing on the building's website. The 3rd floor 2-bedroom, still marked available, $1,850 per month, updated just that morning. Then she called her daughter. Simone Osei-Nkrumah was 22, finishing her last year of law at the University of Toronto. She picked up on the 2nd ring. "How'd it go?" "The unit was suddenly unavailable when I walked in." There was a pause. "The one he told you on Monday was sitting empty for 6 weeks?" "That one." Another pause, longer this time. "Did you screenshot the listing?" "Already done." "Good." Simone's voice had gone very quiet. It was the voice she used when she was thinking hard. Amara had heard it across kitchen tables and courtroom preparation sessions and late-night phone calls from residents. It was not an angry voice. It was a focused one, and it was considerably more frightening. "Okay, Mom, don't file anything yet. Don't call anyone. Just go home and send me the screenshots. I need to make a few calls first." "Simone." "Mom, trust me. Go home." Amara went home. What she didn't know, what Colby certainly didn't know, was that Simone's few calls included one to Professor Elaine Drury at U of T, who ran the school's housing discrimination legal clinic, and one to a colleague at the Ontario Human Rights Commission, a 2nd-year student named Felix, who had a gift for filing requests under the Freedom of Information Act in ways that made property management companies very nervous. And one to a woman named Constance Wharton, who was not a student at all but a senior investigator at the OHRC, who happened to owe Simone a favor from a case the prior winter. Simone did not tell her mother any of this. She just said, "Send me the screenshots," and started writing notes on a legal pad in her apartment. 3 days after Amara's visit to the Millbrook Terrace leasing office, the listing for the third-floor two-bedroom went back up online. Same photos, same price, different contact email. They'd switched it to the building's general inquiry address, the kind of change that looks like an administrative update but is actually an attempt to obscure a paper trail. Simone noticed. She filed it. The thing about housing discrimination in Ontario is that it is both rampant and remarkably easy to prove when someone has taken the trouble to document it carefully. The Human Rights Code prohibits discrimination in housing on the basis of race, place of origin, colour, and family status, among other grounds. The burden of proof is not criminal. You don't need to prove intent. You need to show that the protected characteristic was a factor. And when a unit is unavailable during a call with a black applicant and then relisted 3 days later, the paperwork writes itself. Constance Wharton opened a file on October 4th. She was a compact woman with close-cropped silver locks and the particular manner of someone who had spent 20 years watching people underestimate her. She had handled 340 housing discrimination complaints in her career. She had seen every variation of this story. She was not especially surprised by this one. What did surprise her slightly was the scope. Because when Felix pulled the building's tenancy records through the FOIA request, what came back was not one instance of a qualified black applicant being turned away. It was 11, over 4 years. 11 applicants who had inquired, been told a unit was available, come in for a viewing and then been informed, with brochures and sympathetic nods, that things had somehow changed. 10 of the 11 had given up, moved on, found somewhere else, or stayed somewhere worse. The 11th was a retired schoolteacher named Eunice, who had filed a complaint that had been closed 3 months later when the building's owner, a numbered corporation registered in Milton, provided a letter claiming the unit had been rented to a family member. The OHRC had accepted the letter. Constance, reading it now, noted that the family member had never appeared in any subsequent tenancy record for that unit. She called Simone on a Thursday evening. "I need your mother's complete file, employment verification, the time-stamped screenshots, the recording of the Monday phone call." She recorded the call? Did she? A pause. She will have once I explain to her that she absolutely should have. Ontario is a one-party consent province, Constance said. The call was 4 days ago. If she has any recollection of what was said. She has excellent recollection, Simone said. She's military, she writes incident reports for a living. Then I need that written account, dated and signed by Monday. On Monday morning, Amara Osei-Nkrumah sat at the kitchen table of her temporary housing unit, a furnished suite in a corporate residence building that smelled faintly of other people's cooking, and wrote 6 pages. She wrote them the way she'd been trained to write incident reports, chronologically, precisely, without editorializing. She described Colby's expression. She described the folder he never opened. She described the exact words he used and the exact order in which he used them. She wrote it the way she had written reports about equipment failures and personnel conduct, and the circumstances leading up to situations that no one wanted to put in writing, but that someone had to. She sent it to Simone at 8:14 a.m. Simone forwarded it to Constance by 8:30. Patrick Colby received a letter from the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later. He read it twice, then called the building's owner, a man named Gerald Fitch, who lived in a large house in Oakville and had not personally managed a property in 15 years. Fitch called his lawyer. His lawyer called the numbered corporation's registered agent. The registered agent sent an email to 3 other people, whose names would eventually appear in the file. By the end of that Tuesday, there were 4 lawyers involved, and not one of them had a good answer for why 11 qualified applicants of the same demographic profile had been turned away from the same building over 4 years. The OHRC investigation ran for 6 weeks. During that time, Colby was interviewed twice. He maintained both times that the decisions had been made by the building owner and that he was simply the messenger. The tribunal noted that Colby had been the leasing agent on all 11 rejections. They also noted that Colby had sent a text message to Fitch on the morning of Amara's appointment that read, "Another one coming in today, the sergeant woman from the base. Going to be a tough one to turn." The message had been recovered from a backup Colby had forgotten existed. Colby's lawyer advised him very strongly to stop talking. Fitch's legal team proposed a settlement. Simone, who by this point had been formally retained by her mother and was working under the supervision of Professor Drury, looked at the number and politely declined. "My client is a decorated veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces," Simone said in the mediation session, in a voice so composed it made the mediator adjust his posture. "She has served this country in conditions that none of us in this room will ever experience. She came to your building with a banker's draft and a credit score that would embarrass most of us. She was turned away because of her name and her face. The number you've proposed is an insult." The mediator looked at Fitch's lead counsel. Fitch's lead counsel looked at Fitch. Fitch looked at the table. "They went back in 30 minutes with a different number," Simone countered. "They settled on the third offer." But Simone had made one thing clear before the mediation began. The financial settlement was secondary. The primary condition was systemic. The numbered corporation would be required to implement an anti-discrimination leasing protocol, audited annually by a third party. Colby's employment would be terminated. The 11 previous rejections would be reviewed, and each of those applicants, the ones who could be located, would be contacted directly and offered compensation. Fitch's team tried to negotiate the Colby condition. Simone did not negotiate it. Colby was let go on a Friday afternoon. He was told it was a restructuring. He did not get a reference letter. The tribunal's final ruling was issued in early January. It was a public document. Constance Wharton forwarded it to 2 colleagues at the federal level who were tracking patterns across provincial housing complaints. 3 weeks later, the numbered corporation received a separate inquiry from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation regarding its eligibility for certain federal housing programs that required compliance with the Canadian Human Rights Act. Gerald Fitch, who had owned 11 residential properties across southern Ontario for 2 decades and had never once worried about the names on the applications because he'd hired people to handle all of that, found himself spending a great deal of January and February on the phone with lawyers. Amara by then had found an apartment, not in Millbrook Terrace, a better one, a corner unit on the 4th floor of a building in Barrie's East End, 6 minutes closer to the base, with south and west exposures and a view of Kempenfelt Bay that turned spectacular in the late afternoon. She'd signed the lease in November, moved in with Simone's help on a grey Saturday in December, and put her daughter's room together first. On the first morning in the new apartment, she made coffee and stood at the west window watching the frozen bay catch the early light. She thought about Colby's expression when she'd walked in, the recalibration, the way the smile had come back online. She thought about the 11 people before her who had walked out of that office with brochures and no answers, who had given up because they'd had no Simone, no Constance, no professor with a housing law clinic, and a student with a gift for FOIA requests. She thought about that longer than she thought about anything else. Simone drove up from Toronto on New Year's Day. They ate leftover rice and stew at the kitchen table, the bay visible through the window, grey and still. "You know what the hardest part was?" Amara said. "What?" "Writing that incident report. Not because it was hard to remember, because I had to write it like it didn't make me angry." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "That's the training. Describe what happened. Don't editorialize. Don't tell them how it made you feel." She looked at her daughter. "I've been writing like that my whole career. But I'll tell you, Simone, some things deserve the editorializing." Simone smiled. "That's what lawyers are for." "Is that what they teach you at U of T?" "That, and how to counter the third offer." Amara laughed. It was a full, unguarded sound, the kind that takes over a quiet apartment without asking permission. The bay outside was pale and frozen and beautiful, and the coffee was getting cold, and for the first time in a long time the place she was sitting felt like somewhere she was allowed to be. Colby had thought he was dealing with a quiet rejection, a form letter, a brochure and a polite goodbye in a parking lot. He had not thought about incident reports or time-stamped screenshots or a daughter in her last year of law school who answered the phone on the second ring and immediately asked about documentation. He had not thought about what it means to underestimate a woman who has spent 20 years learning how to survive in institutions that weren't built for her. That was his mistake, and as mistakes go, it was a costly one. Gerald Fitch eventually agreed to a comprehensive audit of his 11 properties. 2 of them failed the review and were referred for additional investigation. His numbered corporation was restructured, its federal housing subsidies suspended pending the outcome. He was not criminally charged, but the civil liability attached to his properties made them considerably less profitable, and 3 of the smaller buildings were quietly listed for sale by spring. Colby applied to 4 property management companies in the Barrie area over the following months. Each of them, conducting standard due diligence, found the tribunal ruling. It was a public document after all. None of them called him back. The Whitfield Community Legal Centre in another city in another story carries another family's name on it. But what Amara Osei-Nkrumah started building in her last year of law school, a template, a file, a repeatable framework for documenting exactly this kind of quiet, deniable, thoroughly ordinary discrimination, that work didn't end with one settlement. It became a clinic module. It was taught the following year to 43 law students. It was cited in 2 subsequent tribunal rulings. One of them involved a veteran, one of them involved a schoolteacher. Amara didn't know all of that when she stood at her west window on New Year's morning. She just knew the light on the bay was worth seeing, and that the apartment was warm, and that her daughter was in the kitchen reheating rice, and that she had gotten here because she had not walked away from that parking lot without taking the screenshot. Small decisions, precise documentation, the willingness to say, this happened, I wrote it down, and I am not going away. That's how it starts. That's always how it starts. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've ever been handed a brochure when you deserved a key, drop a comment below. You are not imagining it, and you are not alone. There's a moment in this story that I keep coming back to. It's not the settlement, it's not the tribunal ruling, or Colby losing his job, or Gerald Fitch spending January on the phone with lawyers. It's Amara sitting in that parking lot for 4 minutes after walking out of the leasing office, not crying, just taking the screenshot. That's where everything turned. Not in the courtroom, not in the mediation session. Right there, in a parking lot outside a building she was never going to live in the 30 seconds it took to raise her phone and document what had just been done to her. I think about that a lot when I hear people say that ordinary people can't fight systems like this, because what Amara had in that parking lot wasn't power or money, she had discipline. She had the habit, built over 20 years in the military, of writing down what happened before she let herself feel it. That's not a small thing, that's a practice. That's the kind of integrity that doesn't announce itself but shows up exactly when it matters. And then there's Simone, 22 years old, last year of law school, and the first question she asks isn't, "Are you okay?" It's, "Did you screenshot the listing?" Because she understood immediately that her mother's experience, as real and as painful as it was, would mean nothing without documentation. She had learned something that a lot of us resist learning, that the truth on its own is not enough. You have to build a case around it. You have to be precise. You have to think 3 steps ahead while you're still hurting. That's not coldness. That's a particular kind of intelligence that takes years to develop, and Simone had developed it because she had watched her mother move through a world that required it of her. What strikes me about how this unfolded is that nobody got lucky. Colby didn't slip up by accident. He sent that text message because he had been doing this for years and no one had ever made him accountable for it. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it had been allowed to work, because the people it failed had no one to call, no framework, no Constance Wharton at the OHRC who knew how to pull tenancy records. What changed wasn't the system. What changed was that this time, the person who walked into that office had spent a career learning how to survive institutions that weren't built for her, and she had raised a daughter who was in the process of learning how to change them. That combination, a mother's steadiness and a daughter's sharpness, is what undid 4 years of quiet, deniable discrimination. Not rage, not luck, steadiness, sharpness, the willingness to keep going when every polite signal in the room is telling you to accept the brochure and leave. 11 people before Amara left. Most of them had just as much right to be angry. Most of them were probably angrier. But anger without documentation, without strategy, without someone who picks up on the second ring and immediately asks about the screenshots. Anger alone doesn't build a clinic module. It doesn't get cited in 2 subsequent tribunal rulings. What Amara did in that parking lot was quiet. It was 4 minutes and a screenshot, but it was the right thing done precisely at the exact moment it needed to be done. That's the part of the story I want to sit with, not the verdict, not the new apartment with the view of the bay, the 4 minutes, the screenshot, the decision to document instead of disappear. Some fights don't announce themselves. They start in parking lots, with a phone in your hand and a daughter who answers on the second ring.